Hello everybody, GM Cry here, and welcome to an endgame repertoire for black. Now, usually when people study openings, what I find that they're doing is they are taking a series of moves that somebody else created and they're trying to wield them like a weapon in their own games. And it makes them feel kind of empowered, especially if that weapon was devised by a very higher mind, whether it was computer or human. And this endgame repertoire is a little bit deeper and more devious than that in its intentions. And what I mean by that is that with this, there's going to be a lot less forcing moves. And what you're really trying to say is two things. One, most people out there playing, even at the higher levels, don't play endgames well. Their openings oftentimes extravagantly deep, but their endgames not so much. And that holds in my experience from class player up to even GM level. It's like if you looked at them, their biceps, if there were their openings would be huge, and their endgames, their legs would just be these shriveled up, tiny, puny things. So the idea of an endgame repertoire is to get to those ending positions. On a deeper level as well, if you're going to try to tackle this repertoire, you are, of course, trying to hone your own endgame skills. And that, I think, is the deeper aim of trying to play an endgame repertoire. It's about yourself, not necessarily just about beating your opponents. By playing these positions that I'm going to show you today, you will simply become much stronger at the endgame and how to think about the endgame in particular. Okay, now the first thing I want to say up front is that we cannot force our opponents into playing an endgame. And white in general has the option of playing the ending. The idea of this opening is simple. We play d6, e5 against almost everything they do, and they have the option to take it. And then in this first video, I'm going to show the endgames that can arise, and then in the next we'll talk about the other things, and that's a totally different field of battle when they do not take the pawn. All right, so let's first look at this English position. Sometimes it arises with d4 first, and talk about this endgame, and then it'll help us understand the other endgames that arise of this d6, e5. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out that'll help us, I hope, understand what we're after in this opening is that if white plays the very basic developing moves, knight c3 and knight f3, it's hard to imagine, but these are actually bad moves, okay? And what's happened is the pawns on c6 and f6 dominate the knights, and it's now very difficult actually for white to find a plan. So even though the computer says now that black is only a little bit better, I would say black on a practical level is much better. And that is because the knights really are now undeveloped on c3 and f3. They got to figure out something else to do. And one of the key features of this opening that I really want to stress is when they take on d8, they are probably motivated by the idea that your king will now be weak because it is uncastled. That is generally not the case, and in most of the examples that I'm going to show today, the king actually ends up being a fighting piece. Surprisingly, it's harder for white to keep his king in the center than it is for black, and a key skill in this opening for black will be to decide where does the king go. Does it go, as in this case, to c7, where it really controls a lot of nice squares, or does it go to squares like e7, e8, or c8? The point is white doesn't know where the king will go, and we are then going to decide where to put it ourselves. And a lot of the skill in this opening is going to be that decision. Now, something I want to stress, when we talk about king activity, in this phase of the game, we're not talking about the king marching and like grabbing a bunch of pawns. That might come later. What we're talking about is the king's ability to really grab a lot of key squares, oftentimes on the D file, right? Whether we're on E7 or C7, we're going to be grabbing those squares on the D file. And that's just important. It's a kind of glue that will hold our position together. And especially if he tries to come at us, that will be an extra piece for us. And we're going to see a lot of positions where the white king simply finds it hard to get into the battle himself. So even though when we start off, we're going to get a lot of positions like this, it's going to seem like our king is a victim. On a long-term sense, what the king really has is an opportunity to be a fighting piece. And some of the things that I want to really stress by using this example is to think about the individual pieces just in terms of their activity. And what I mean by that going forward is that winning this position and winning endgames like this in general has to do with just thinking about good pieces and bad pieces. So for example, bad, bad, great. And if we have any piece that needs to figure itself out, it's the G8 knight. And, that can go find its way out in a variety of ways. But that's up to us later to figure out. Okay, now something I want to say. We're going to transition now to E4, which, if you imagine the game could start E4, D6 or D4, D6, we're going to do the same thing anyway. That if they play C4, in this position and take, it doesn't, what I want you to see is we could do a bunch of games, and I'll put some illustrative games of this variation into the description of the video. But what I want to stress is that the C4 pawn is not helpful on C4. So that's already just something you should say, oh right, so when we compare the other positions, we'll say, right, the C4 pawn, not clear if it's helping at all out there. And in fact, it might make it a little more difficult for white to control squares around it. Okay, so now let's get into the meat of it. And it is possible in this position to play E5. And I might talk a little bit about that in the next video. But for this purposes of this video, let's talk about this position and takes. Now again, they don't have to take, and we'll talk about that in the next video. So takes, and one thing that I found just amazing about this position for myself is I assumed that white should be better the first time I saw this. And it was a revelation to me that the computer also thinks that when you first turn it on, but then you start going through some moves, and it's very hard to prove an advantage for white here. So that's already, I think, a psychological advantage, because most people, I think, who take on D8 will have the same feeling that I have, namely that white has the advantage. And then by trying to prove that, that's where they will get in trouble. Okay, so let's look at an illustrative game. This is Carlsen is black against Vallejo pawns. A lot of strong GMs have played this as black through the years. And let's just see how it goes. Knight F3, and let's just say in general, I'm going to list the main moves as I see them. Bishop G5, Bishop C4, F4, and Knight F3. Bishop D6, Bishop G5, Bishop E6, castles, Knight D7. And let's call this just like one of the fundamental setups for the black pieces. And it might seem like white should have an advantage, and white, I'm sure, thought so too when he played Knight B5. The weird thing is about this is that, yes, you can grab this bishop, but look at how Carlsen's king now finds that great pocket. And this is what I mean about the king being clever in terms of finding a square. He took and played Bishop B5. And I'm sure there's many moves here for black. Carlsen just put his rooks in natural positions, kicked the bishop, thank you very much. And already black seems better to me. And they ended up getting this very fascinating opposite color bishop position. And black is a little bit better. So white didn't do anything egregiously wrong. And d4 is, of course, a stunning Carlsen-style move where we're going to open the position for the bishop. And I'll leave this in the description. And let me just say, this is an example, a Fisher ending here, of the kind of thing that you would want to feel good about playing at the end of this, at the end of your game. And it really is, when you play like this, especially if you're playing an over-the-board game, which we'll hopefully get back to soon, it's a macho thing to do because it's saying to your opponent, my intention is to sit here for quite some time. Also, let me stress, when we go back to this position, a lot of people, when they think about learning the ending, they think about the Dvoretsky book. And that is a bunch of algorithms that you can apply at the very end of the game. And that's very important, don't get me wrong. But playing this well will be more about thinking about good pieces and bad pieces in the kinds of situations you want. And that's a different kind of skill that is really achieved through practice. Okay, so that was an example with knight f3. Let me show a couple more examples here. So bishop g5, bishop e6, castles, knight d7, f4, ef, and the great news here is very interesting is that e5, if e5, we're just going to play h6. And basically, it's important to see that this pawn on e4 is pretty lonely. And if he gives us that dark square bishop, well, it's going to be rough for the dark squares for black. So I'm going to show two quick examples. This is a game with Beliavsky as white and Adams as black. Let me flip this here. c6. Notice we're dominating the knight, but unlike the last example, our king might not go to e7. And here, Adams played the very natural king e7. To me, it seems like knight h5 is pretty cool because wherever he goes, let's say here, we're going to give a check and then something like bishop f4 next. Very nice position for black. And indeed, the king will probably end up coming to e7. And just again, we got this, the weak pawn mostly means that eventually we're going to aim to put this beautiful knight on e5. And nota bene, the knight on c3 has got to figure itself out. There was another game recently between two of my students. Knight ge2 was played, and variety of things that black can do. Here, I liked h6, and the point is that those double pawns aren't that big of a deal. And I already kind of like black better here because we will again play c6 whenever we like, and king e7, really no problem. Another thing that you probably will see is this violent attempt for f4. And maybe just a touch of history here. In a lot of the endings with c6 and king c7, the old-time Soviets really thought that f4 was the key move in a variety of positions. And it is certainly an interesting thing, especially if the king is on c7, to give the king a little bit of grief. But something let's just stress here is that our king is not committed to c7. And we'll look at fe next, or excuse me, fe next. But this is just very simple, and again, we're going to occupy the e5 square. The king can go to e7 at its leisure. If you take bishop d2, is the best I could come up with for white. And well, by the way, there's a lot of moves here. Bishop e6, rook e8. I'll just show bishop e6. But something I want to stress about it is it's very difficult for white to approach this with a sense that the moves are going to be forcing. In fact, there's a lot of variation, different things that black can do to get a totally successful, opening. So that's pretty much the long and the short of it. I would say studying or just reviewing some of the illustrative games that I put in the description is a really good start. In my experience of playing this, both in Blitz and on normal games, you'll probably get it about 40 to 50% of the time, and the other portion will be in lines where they do not take the queen. Let me just end it by saying something I've observed with players all the way up to even 2300 is in endgame positions, they're not even realizing how complicated and rich they are. And I see that in how quickly they move. I've seen this time and time again. And so it's not just the quality of the moves that makes me say that most players aren't playing the end game well. It's also just the attitude. And so when you play this, you are trying, of course, to improve your own ending play, but also to take advantage of this weakness that so many players out there have toward the end game. Okay, I look forward to seeing you in part 2.